The Social Order of Tomorrow, State and Society in the Atomic Age, by Otto von Habsburg. Chapter 1. Where do we stand? It has become commonplace to speak of the crisis of our time. Everyone talks about it without bothering to devote much thought to the meaning of the phrase. The crisis has been accepted as a fact. It is regarded as an act of nature, like a typhoon or an earthquake. And as in the case of a natural cataclysm, the size of the event transcends the individual power of judgment, so that it is simply taken for granted. It is plain today that the developments initiated by the First World War are still proceeding unchecked. A world has collapsed in ruins and no new order has so far appeared. Many explanations have been offered for these developments, but none of them have been entirely satisfactory. They have almost all passed by the essential facts and concern themselves with mere symptoms. The same blinkered attitude is apparent in the tendency to leave the solution of our problems to a mechanical logic of events. It is very much easier to drift and allow the blind forces of nature or progress to find their own solution. This is the attitude of the majority of so-called statesmen today. They all know that things cannot continue as at present, but none sees a clear way ahead. A few hope for a solution through a return to the past. These are the true reactionaries of our time, even though they frequently wear a progressive label. Others, and they are perhaps in the majority, try to apply a variety of palliatives, moving from one problem to the next and closing one breach by opening a larger one elsewhere. In the last resort, they are hoping for a miracle. Meanwhile, they are devoting their efforts to keeping up an appearance of law and order, at least for the duration of their term of office. They no longer believe that they will be able to work out a constructive and comprehensive plan for the future. In their blindness, they declare the problems confronting them insoluble. They know instinctively that their world is no longer viable, but lack the courage and vision to create a new one. They take refuge in the no man's land between yesterday and tomorrow. This defeatist attitude is unjustified. Ours is not the first turning point in the history of mankind, and each time the crisis was mastered at the moment when men found the courage to look at the situation realistically and to draw the right conclusions. Once this point had been reached, the prevailing uncertainty disappeared as quickly as it had come. Today the future lies once again in our hands. We are not the playthings of blind forces, but free men who, in accordance with the will of God, are able to shape their own lives. Unfortunately, this has been forgotten by most of our leaders. But no one has the right to excuse himself by referring to circumstances. Circumstances are there to be mastered. In order to draw the right conclusions, we must first see the situation and its causes as they really are. We must know where we stand before we can proceed further. Such an analysis of the present situation demands a brief survey of the past, for without a past there can be no future. Man is both heir and ancestor at the same time. He must absorb his inherited tradition and preserve those parts of it that are of permanent validity. At the same time, he must do everything in his power to prepare the ground for the coming generations. Our generation has already squandered too many of the values of the past. It is high time that it should start to create in its turn. The social problem. The social structure of modern Europe was determined by the Industrial Revolution, the victory of the machine. This was the greatest upheaval in recorded history. Though it did not occur everywhere simultaneously, it has, directly or indirectly, exerted a profound influence on the life of every nation in the world. Until the appearance of the machine and the beginning of industrialization, Europe and the whole world were living under an agrarian order. Agriculture was the basis of economic and hence also of social life. Wealth meant the ownership of land, and trade was mainly in agricultural products. The towns were dependent on the countryside. Though they sometimes succeeded in arrogating a leading position to themselves, this was not of lasting duration. In the last resort, the free peasants and the great landowners were the masters of society. It is not surprising that this society was unable to comprehend the completely altered conditions created by the growth of industry. The whole spirit of the new developments was alien to it, so that it only began to concern itself seriously with the social consequences of the great upheaval when it was too late. Had it been properly planned and thought out, even the first phase of the Industrial Revolution could have been a blessing for all. The development could have been directed into peaceful, constructive channels. Since there was no one able to do this, however, everything was left to chance, and chaos resulted. A wild, untrammeled competition took place among those who tried to monopolize the new sources of wealth for their personal gain. The consequences were disastrous. As in every struggle, more and more brutal weapons came to be used, and whoever used them most unscrupulously had the best chance of success. The old social order collapsed, as though hit by a whirlwind. The symbols and social forms of the past were destroyed, and nothing that could provide an equal social coherence was put in their place. For the institutionalization of the economic free-for-all, as it used to be preached by the apostles of economic liberalism, is not a system. It is, at best, the recognition of anarchy as a principle of order, by those who do not want to admit that they lack the strength to master the chaos. This social crisis coincided, of course, with the appearance of a hitherto unknown class on the historical scene. Like every new class, the workers were weak, and many of them, too, were unable to understand what was happening. Still thinking in terms of the old agrarian society, they did not realize that a new social order was coming into being. This also explains the passivity of many who, according to the doctrines and principles they professed, should have been the natural allies of the poorest sections of the community. The result of these developments was the class struggle. It was started from above, by the capitalists, in the form of economic liberalism. From below came the reply of the disinherited, the demand for a share of the new wealth, for the indispensable minimum of economic security. It was the blindness of the haves that thus opened up a social gulf within every country, and Marxism, the political expression of an already existing tension, later deepened this gulf still further. For a whole century, Europe was to suffer from the consequences of the blindness of that first generation. One may justly assert that a planned industrialization, under the banner of social justice, could have raised our whole continent to almost unimaginable heights. Without the destructive class struggle, the whole concentrated production potential of Europe could have been used in the service of peace and construction. Instead of the fratricidal squandering of our powers, they could have been used for the benefit of all. It was the tragedy of Europe that the Industrial Revolution and the appearance of new classes came at a time when we were not prepared for them morally. The Renaissance had opened the door to pagan ideas. The social outlook which one should have been able to take for granted among Christians was lacking at the decisive moment, both among those who called themselves enlightened and those for whom the faith was merely a matter of outward forms. The last century was an era of social welfare. All European countries were in a state of latent, or at least potential, civil war. Untrammeled economic competition was followed by untrammeled competition in power politics. Under these conditions, little of constructive value could be achieved. There was no lack of high-sounding phrases, but the spirit of construction was absent. The outward facade of economic prosperity could not make up for this lack, for we can see today that it was largely financed with checks drawn on the future, which we are today unable to honor. The vast capital of the past has been spent. The present condition of the working class. Now, at the end of this period of class struggle of liberalism and Marxism, a solution is nevertheless gradually coming into being. The rising power of the workers, coupled with the appearance of the managers, is creating an equilibrium and is putting an end to the most violent inequalities. These still exist in some parts of Europe, and still more in other continents, but the fact that more and more states are able to even out the disparities is infectious. Social injustices are being got rid of more and more quickly, and the example of successful solutions makes it easier to avoid mistakes. One can learn from the experience of others. It can therefore be said that since the end of the Second World War, the class struggle has practically come to an end in the most important industrial countries of Europe, as well as in America and Australia. Its phrases and symbols are still with us, but they have begun to sound hollow, and the old slogans are seen to be inappropriate. The manual worker has ceased to be a proletarian in the classical sense. It is significant that, in a recent American public opinion poll, more than 90% of the workers regarded themselves as belonging to the middle class. In the Soviet bloc, the development has been entirely different. The class differences which are being abolished in the West have there reappeared anew, coupled with a system of slavery which differs from that of antiquity only in that it is no longer individuals, but a police apparatus that owns the victims who have been deprived of their freedom. One should not, however, lay too much stress on the neo-feudalism of the Soviet ruling class. In the first place, the social side of this development is overshadowed by power political ambitions and considerations. And secondly, everything is so much in flux east of the Iron Curtain that the present state of affairs cannot be regarded as permanent. Russia has not yet found a stable form of social and political existence. The crisis of the leadership of the communist countries is merely the outward expression of subterranean forces. Many among the new leading cadres who are being trained for positions of power in the East no longer believe in the old doctrines of Marxism-Leninism. The facts have taught them otherwise. Whether their views are preferable from the humanitarian point of view to those of the present rulers is, however, highly doubtful. If, in the free world, the worst and most dangerous social and political consequences of the Industrial Revolution have now been overcome, that must not be a cause for smug self-satisfaction. The positive side of this achievement is still missing. The fact that the worst damages have been repaired is good, but it is not enough. The social integration of the two partners in industry is not yet complete, for every social order must ultimately be genuinely constructive. All its members must have a stake in its existence. Certainly, the reconciliation of the working class with the state and society has made much progress, but a good deal still remains to be done before it is placed on enduring moral and not merely material foundations. The integration of the working class can only be regarded as complete when there are no more fundamental differences between the different partners in the social order, nor any fear, however hidden, on either side. Of course, absolute equality will never be attained. That is an ideal which is not of this world. But an order can be created in which each section of the community can justly feel that it is in no way inferior to any other, where each section regards the state as its state. The chronic agrarian crisis. The situation has improved in the very fields that were most crisis-ridden in the past. At the same time, we must not overlook a new danger which is threatening us, especially since the end of the Second World War. A new proletariat is coming into being through the decay of two social classes which have so far appeared satisfied. Simultaneously with the rise in the standard of living of the industrial workers, we can see serious signs of crises elsewhere. And since we are only too prone to succumb to the temptation of thinking in terms of categories belonging to the past, there is a danger that we may overlook a development which could be controlled with proper foresight. We mean the decline of the agricultural and the middle class, which is threatening to assume catastrophic proportions, and could create new and far-reaching problems. That the relative importance of agriculture in the context of the whole economy was bound to decline is not surprising. With the appearance of industry, the share in the social product of other sections became necessarily smaller, and it was only logical that the percentage of the population employed in agriculture would diminish. The much-discussed flight from the land was to some extent unavoidable and even justified. For industry needs labor power, and it could only take it from where it was available. The disappearance of a certain amount of marginal farming was also a necessary part of the process. So long as this happened within reasonable limits, it was perhaps regrettable, but hardly to be avoided. The situation only became dangerous at the beginning of the 20th century. We see in many countries an accelerating diminution in the amount of land owned by peasants. The flight from the land increases in almost geometric proportions. The main cause of this phenomenon is the fact that in European agriculture, the number of marginal units is constantly increasing. Many of them owe their continued existence to subsidies or savings from periods of exceptional earnings, wars or inflations, and to a share in forest properties. More and more, European agriculture is unable to guarantee a sufficient income to those employed in it. The gap between agricultural and industrial prices has grown too wide. The agrarian scissors, far from closing, are opening farther all the time. In spite of hard, by comparison with industry, very hard work, the farmer is hardly assured of the bare necessities of life. The relatively low standard of living on the land, and it is sinking with terrifying rapidity by comparison with the towns, naturally results in an exodus of the younger generations. Friendly advice, sermons about traditional virtues and Spartan simplicity will avail nothing. Pious wishes cannot improve a situation, particularly if their only object is to hide the fact that no one knows what is to be done about it. Subventions, on the other hand, are also no solution. From the historical point of view, they are merely palliatives. At best, they may enable one to buy time in which to make a decision, but they cannot provide security. It has never proved possible to maintain one section of the community at the expense of other sections for any length of time. We must see the situation clearly. If this development continues, Europe will arrive in the not-too-distant future at the point where the United States are now. Only about 10% of her population are able to make their living in agriculture. In the special circumstances of the American continent, this has so far not proved dangerous, but one must remember that America has not known any serious social tensions or external threats. All her wars took place far from her coasts, her communications were never in danger, and her individual regions were never forced to fend for themselves. Otherwise, a major catastrophe would have occurred, such as we in Europe were only able to avoid by decentralization. Nor must we forget that the United States have never had a peasantry in our sense of the word. It was an economy of large units, and even the small proprietor was not closely tied to his soil. The American farmer regards the soil merely as an instrument of production. The difference between the European and the American outlook in these matters is not merely military or political. The whole structure of our economy forces us to keep the differences between ourselves and the New World in mind, and not imitate the latter blindly. We must not become passive spectators of an agrarian development which would upset our whole painfully established equilibrium, for an agrarian crisis would affect not only agriculture but wider sections of the community. It could lead to just as much social and political unrest as the crises generated by the rise of the industrial working class. Problems of the middle class. While our farming population is, economically speaking, fighting for its life, the position of the middle class is not much better. The section of the community which was the main pillar of society in the 19th century is in open decline. The mass organizations and the great financial interests have turned their backs on it. The trend towards centralization must necessarily destroy the small, independent businessmen and tradesmen. We hear continually that these groups stand in the way of progress, and are therefore rightly being eliminated. Less noticeable, but no less dangerous, is the economic situation of the intelligentsia. The low esteem in which intellectual work is held today has spread to such an extent that this type of career frequently no longer attracts the children of manual workers, unless they feel specially drawn to the service of the community, even at a financial sacrifice. While the future of the West urgently demands a strong, self-confident intelligentsia, our social policies are tending towards the intellectual impoverishment of the coming generations. Today, the middle class still plays an important part in our social life. From this class originated those impulses which continually accelerated economic progress. At the same time, it was the function of the middle class to prevent the head-on collision of social extremes. It is by nature a mediator. And finally, it should not be forgotten that it was largely the middle class that supplied the political leadership. The great danger today is that the middle class will be crushed by the pressure of more powerful interests, the organized masses, and the great concentrations of financial power. At the same time, the state subjects this section of the community to the, relatively speaking, heaviest burdens of all. This is a consequence of the structure of our modern democracies, as this section of the community is mostly not sufficiently highly organized, and too small numerically to make its demands heard effectively. It is also the section which finds it most difficult to escape taxation. The big businessman has many ways of evading tax. The small tradesman, the employee, and the small businessman have little chance of keeping their income secret, and they lack the contacts which would enable them to ameliorate their lot through political pressure. For these reasons, the proletarianization of the middle class is already far advanced. This means a radicalization of political life in a section of the community which has always been politically minded. A despairing political reaction is particularly liable to take place. Such reactions mostly lead to irrational behavior, not surprising in a drowning man. The consequences of present-day developments are therefore not difficult to foresee. We have had one example already. Had the Weimar Republic not been so completely lacking in comprehension for the despair of the German middle class, Hitler would never have come to power. Thus, at a decisive moment, when new forces are appearing on the stage of the future, our social and political situation is critical. Though the working class has, to a considerable extent, been successfully deproletarianized, it has still not been fully integrated into the social order. A new orientation of the state, which would take full account of the special position of the working class and would remove the still existing mistrust between the various sections of the community, has still to be achieved. We have not yet completely moved into the 20th century, and still drag behind us too many of the false values of a past epoch. At the same time, a new proletariat is about to arise, unless immediate countermeasures are taken. This is a particularly dangerous development because in the near future we shall have to face new economic problems, which will require our undivided attention. Otherwise, the new forces, which could be a potential blessing for us, will wreak as much destruction as the Industrial Revolution in the last century. We should regard it as a serious warning that an outbreak of Luddism occurred recently in England. This writing on the wall does not mean that history will repeat itself, but we must learn to read the signs of the times correctly. It lies with us what form the new developments will ultimately take.